This week on Dialogue, playing with fire, Pakistan at war with itself. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guest. Pamela Constable is a foreign correspondent and former deputy foreign editor at The Washington Post. In recent years, she's reported extensively from Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Iraq. She's also a former Wilson Center fellow and the author of this book, Playing with Fire, Pakistan at War with Itself. Pam, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Let me first ask you about the notion of creating a better understanding, the reason that you wrote the book. Can you somehow describe what the current level of understanding that you encounter is among Americans of Pakistan?
Well, I would say actually sort of it's a two-way street of very limited and often very misguided understanding or a lot of misperceptions and myths on both sides. You know, a lot of Americans, for example, think of Pakistan as sort of this, you know, nation of terrorists, you know, a place that spawned, you know, Al-Qaeda and all these, you know, radical militant groups, and as a threat, of course, of nuclear power. So great concern over that. All of which is true, but you know it's also a huge country of 180 million people, the vast majority of whom are absolutely sort of like anyone else, you know, working and raising their families, you know, not part of Al-Qaeda, not part of the Taliban, have their own problems, their own concerns, which I try to explore in my book. And so my idea was to try and give Western readers, English-speaking readers, audiences, just a much broader, you know, a backdrop or sort of conceptual framework, context for the problems we do have with these groups. And
you're out on the book tour, and are you finding that audiences are eager for this information? Are they seeking this perspective that you're attempting
Absolutely.
to share?
I mean, of course, you get, you know, obvious questions. People want to know about U.S. policy and about, you know, what officials there are doing and sort of the war against terror. But also people are really fascinated to learn much more about a country that you know, they know that it's important, but they don't really know why.
Well, what about the other side of the coin, Pakistanis and their view of America?
Yes, that's really, you know, it's a huge problem, and it's one that I explore in considerable depth, actually, in the book. I mean, there's been this growing a tide of emotional anti-Americanism there. I mean, if you look back to the past in the Cold War, of course, you know, the two countries were closely allied. They've had a long-standing close relationship. You know, hundreds of thousands of Pakistanis, you know, every year would apply for visas to try to go to school or work in the United States. There's a large Pakistani community in the United States. So the relationship is a long one and a close one. But basically, I mean, not to put, you know, too fine a point on it, but basically since 9/11, you've had this real U-turn, and you've seen increasingly negative perceptions of the United States and of the West pervade in the Pakistani media and by officials and, of course, by religious groups as well as political parties. And so people, many people in Pakistan, all the public opinion polls now show, if you ask Pakistanis, you know, who's your major enemy, you know, they say the United States, which, I mean, the irony of that is enormous. I mean, we've been, you know, sending them, you know, many hundreds of millions of dollars in economic and military support for many years.
Wasn't this supposed to get better when we made the switch from President Bush to President Obama?
Well, I guess there was this momentary feeling that it might, since Obama made a huge personal effort to reach out to the Muslim world. He went to Cairo, made a very well-regarded speech on that topic, and you know he's a very engaging sort of global person. But then, of course, what happened was that for various reasons, his administration has stepped up this attack of campaign of drone attacks, the unmanned planes that are attacking suspected militant sites along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that has gotten the Pakistani public more riled up than ever.
Mm-hmm. I know that it's difficult to kind of quantify this, but it's not a failed state, but it has stability issues. How stable or unstable is Pakistan?
It is a very good question. In my book, I say that Pakistan has often been called a failed state, but I don't see it as a failed state. In fact, I quote an analyst there whom I interviewed many times, who said it's closer to a fake state. It's a state that if you look at it on paper, I mean, it has all the trappings of a modern state. It has parliament and president and Supreme Court and a vibrant press. It has,
and nuclear weapons.
Well, nuclear weapons, but I'm really thinking in terms of governance now.
Sure.
I mean, in terms of what is modern state? How does it
functioning on a high level?
Functioning on a high level. Huge administrative bureaucracy, huge professional army. Lots and lots of institutional reasons to think that it is a functioning state. The problem is that many of the institutions don't work. Political institutions have never matured. It's had a very, very unhappy political history of, never having had a single elected leader finish their term in office, either been killed or thrown out, or a variety of things have happened, taken over by the military a number of times. So the political institutions have never really had a chance to mature. But to answer your question specifically, I guess Pakistan is probably more stable than many other countries in the developing world. It has had a number of military interventions, but it hasn't fallen apart as a result. It hasn't had a civil war. It hasn't had a revolution. It's struggling. It's a country that's still struggling to emerge into the modern world. Now, the Islamic militant groups, are doing their best to really rock the boat. And one of Pakistan's big problems is that it's taken the military establishment a very long time to take that threat as seriously as they should have. They're beginning to now, and they are now, but it's been a very long time coming.
Well, you even suggest that not only did they take a long time to consider the threat, but that in many ways the government and the military has encouraged that type of thinking.
Well, they encouraged it, and it's important to add, so did we. Back during the Cold War, everybody supported the Islamic guerrilla groups because they were the fighters against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan.
Shared enemy. Former allies become the future enemies.
Exactly. And so once that was over, and once the Soviets were defeated, and once the West sort of withdrew its attention from the region, you still had thousands of these guys running around, and they'd been formed and reinforced and armed and equipped by, among others, us. And so there they were, running around basically with nothing to do.
They're warriors with nothing to do.
Warriors with nothing to do. Now, many of them veered off into the Kashmir fight with India, so that was sort of a side show in a way. But in the meantime, they had put down roots. These Islamic groups, with a lot of help from Saudi Arabia, had built hundreds of mosques and seminaries around the country, and they were working very hard to supplant or displace Pakistan's traditional sort of tolerant, middle-of-the-road version of Islam with a much more radical and punitive version of Islam, which they've been increasingly doing.
One of the themes that you address directly and indirectly throughout the book is this notion that we're talking about a culture where honor is really important and fundamental, and that it feels under siege, feels a sense of humiliation. Can you describe this or express this in a way that Americans might understand? When you're the superpower for decades, it's hard to get this.
It's not quite so much honor. I mean, the concept of honor is in my book, but in a very different context, having to do with male pride and control over women, daughters, and wives. That's very different.
A dark side, but a prominent part of the culture.
Well, actually, I would say that in Pakistan, it applies mostly to what I'd call a sense of sort of national self-esteem. The reason that Pakistan's population is so strongly supportive of being having a nuclear arsenal, because it's really put them on the map internationally. I mean, they feel even they call it the Islamic bomb. They feel we are the only a Muslim nation, with its own nuclear power, and sort of this gives us a great deal of satisfaction and high profile. I would use the word sovereignty more than honor. There's this enormous obsession with national sovereignty, and that's one of the reasons the drone campaign has been so controversial. And every time there's any sort of border skirmish, and a couple of American special forces guys stray over the tribal border, which, as we all know, is porous anyway, and is not even really recognized. But you get a couple of troops straying over the border, and all hell breaks loose. So this notion, and just to add to that, when the Navy SEAL team went in and captured and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, this was regarded as a major affront to national sovereignty in Pakistan. And so this, the response there to that event was very, very different than it was
And the
here.
celebrations. And you committed an entire chapter to the drones and the drone campaign.
Well, actually, I call the chapter drones, but the topic of that chapter, I use it in two ways. I'm talking about the drone planes, but I'm also talking about drone people. I'm talking about, why does somebody become a suicide bomber? How do you turn an ordinary person into essentially a drone?
And how do you? What is your answer?
Well, I don't have the full answer. Certainly, but I've seen enough examples of it to be able to talk about it. And the case that I describe in the most detail in the book is the case of Faisal Shahzad, who was remarkable in that he was not poor, he was not deprived, he was not some sort of tribal guy susceptible to the blandishments of the Taliban. He is the privileged son of the second highest ranking official in the Pakistani Air Force. He grew up in an affluent family. He was sent to both college and graduate school in the United States. He completed both, got a job in financial industry, lived in Connecticut, bought a house, got married and started a family. He seemed to be having some personal and professional problems, but on the face of it, he was, the classic sort of affluent immigrant into the United States from a very successful background. And nevertheless, within 2 years, he had gone from being that to being something completely different, to being someone who was willing to stage a terrorist attack against the United States. And I interviewed his family, his friends. I went to his home village, read lots about him. But most interestingly, actually, was the public statement that he wrote and delivered at his sentencing at trial, which was an extraordinary sort of manifesto. When you think about who he was, you just can't believe
where it came from,
that he turned into this sort of, person who adamantly believed in this black and white struggle between East and West, between Islam and Christianity, that it was this sort of personal mission from God. And to answer your question, basically what happened was he began to get interested in religion, and he started going on the internet and getting into all these websites from all these radical groups, and exchanging messages and learning more about it, and being encouraged over the internet to get more involved. Started going more to mosques. Apparently, even started asking his wife to wear a veil, which of course she had not done in the United States. And then he made a couple of trips to Pakistan, during which he apparently met some of these militant groups who sort of scooped him up and brought him more under their wing and radicalized him further. He grew a beard when he came back. I interviewed some people that had seen him when he came back wearing a beard, came back for a wedding, and I said, well, did that send off any alarm bells? And people said, no, why should it? I mean, he's a Muslim. Many Muslims wear beards. It didn't seem to be anything strange, but it was, in fact, a sign of his increasing radicalization. Well, so it was this very short but very radical process.
Yeah, and a lot of associations with the story you tell. That it's fascinating. One thing I'm thinking as I'm sitting here listening to you tell the tale is that it shows why profiling is often a dead-end street. You don't always fit the description.
That's right.
But then also in your book, you talk about the fact that this return to traditional religion, or the draw of traditional religion, is largely, or at least partially, part of a sense of nowhere else to turn. Absolutely.
Yes, I'm glad you put it that way, because one of the one of the main issues that I talk about in the book is injustice, that there's this, great feeling of injustice or lack of access to justice in the society. It's not only about poverty, it's about people just feeling they don't have avenues for their grievances. They go to the court system, if you pay a big bribe, you win the case no matter what. So if you're poor, you always lose, essentially. And it's the sense of injustice, and of course, there's terrible corruption. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. That's very well known. So when groups like the Taliban come in, when groups like these religious extremists come in, the message that they send out is that we will bring justice. They equate in people's mind the notion of settling your problems with bringing in Sharia law. And so people have these concepts mixed up in their mind. They think, oh yes, they're going to bring Sharia, now everything's going to be fine. They may not really understand what that means.
I want to ask you about one story in I don't remember which chapter, and help me with the pronunciation, but the story of Mukhtar Mai. And speaking of Sharia law, tell us about this, the woman who was gang raped, and then the sentence, or at least the decree from the tribal elders.
Right. That's a slightly different issue in that did not relate directly to Sharia law. It had much more to do with tribal tradition.
And make the distinction for us, because we often lump the two together.
Okay. Well, in many of the tribal areas of both Afghanistan and Pakistan, the state doesn't really call the shots in terms of police and law and courts. Many matters are settled by tribal councils, which means that the men, the oldest men, or just the men who are the leaders of tribal villages, will simply decide what is the law, will simply decide what is the punishment. This is particularly true in what you'd call personal matters, land disputes, family feuds, personal issues among families. And it's very true in the case of cases relating to women. Elopement, divorce, problems within families, are often settled by these councils, and of course they're all men, and they tend to be very strict, and very severe. And in the case of particularly couples that marry or elope against the wishes of their families, this is considered to be a threat to the entire way of life, because marriages in that society are basically tribal alliances. They have nothing to do with the desires or wishes of the couple, and everything to do with the importance of building alliances.
And is the foundation of this thinking an interpretation of Islam?
No, not particularly.
Where does it come from then? What is the tradition?
It comes from clanism. It comes from, and it's true in many countries, not just Islamic countries.
Just ancient tribalism.
Ancient tribalism, which is when the tribe and the clan is everything, when all you have is your personal, relationships within your village, within your tribe, and sort of the rest of the world is the enemy, and you don't regard the state as your defender or protector.
So how do you negotiate all these things? You have the tribal customs traditions you just described.
Right.
You have Sharia law. You have the remnants of the British system of courts and justice. How do they all interact?
It's a tricky combination, although we should probably finish telling the story
yes,
now that you've mentioned
I'm
Mukhtar.
sorry, I did.
But it's a tricky combination. You have existing side by side the state justice system, which is a modern constitutional system of courts and justice. You have the tribal, what they call parallel justice system, which is in many ways what they do is not legal. But basically the police and the courts don't intervene. They leave them alone. And then you have this third...
Sounds like a form of diplomatic immunity or something like that.
Sort of. And then, of course, you have Sharia law. There are Sharia courts. Sharia law is Islamic law. It only applies to certain things. And it has certain very strict rules and punishments. But it is another parallel system of justice. So all of those the three things exist within Pakistan.
And often find themselves in conflict.
Yes.
Which could lead to this sense of a lack of justice from the populace.
Or at least confusion.
Or confusion. Right.
But just to finish the story of Mukhtar Mai, she's an extraordinary woman. She was, her case is really incredible. She, and it involves all those forms of justice. She was a tribal woman who was not doing anything wrong. She was the sister of a teenage boy who was accused of essentially having an affair with, but basically I think only flirting with, a girl from a different tribe. And these were teenagers, and they were seen in a field talking. There was some, who knows what they were doing in the field, but basically they were sort of, together in a field. Well, this caused huge uproar among the tribes. I mean, they were not married. They were simply two teenagers from different tribes. As punishment for this, terrible crime of two teenagers sort of, being together, it's a long story, but basically what happened to her was that she was sentenced by this tribal council from the village, which included elders from both families. She was sentenced to be raped by members of that council. That was in compensation for the fact that her little brother, 13-year-old boy, was having some sort of friendship with a girl from another tribe. Now, they, of course, the accused all denied it, gave a different version of the story, said that in fact the arrangement, the compensation had been that she had agreed, or she had been ordered to marry someone from the other tribe, and that's what that was all about. But initially, I believe 14 men from that tribal council were actually arrested. Only after the press found out about it and the police were sort of forced to intervene. They weren't going to at all. They finally intervened. 14 people were arrested. The case worked its way all the way through the court system. Eventually, more and more of them were let go as they more and more courts sort of found lack of evidence. And then finally, in the end, I believe there were only 3 left in the court system. And then just a few months ago, now I guess it's been almost a year, the Supreme Court finally reviewed the case and let them all go except for one guy, and basically said, this is again all male Supreme Court, basically said they didn't believe her after all that. We're talking about 10 years later.
Yeah.
So it was really, the whole thing was quite shocking.
You, in the chapter that you write about the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, you call the chapter "The Murder of Democracy." Right. Hyperbole, or you think that's what happened?
Well, I use the phrase in several different ways. In fact, the very end of that chapter says something to the effect that the assassination of Benazir Bhutto was a major blow to Pakistani democracy. But there are those who would argue that it died a long time ago with Muhammad Ali Jinnah, when the founder of Pakistan, who died much too soon after the founding of Pakistan. And you can argue that Pakistani democracy never really had a chance. So that's really what I'm referring to. But yes, her assassination, of course, she had already had 2 truncated terms in office. As prime minister, she had had a lot of difficulties and problems as prime minister, but she remained by far the most charismatic, popular leader in the country. And she was attempting a political comeback at the time she was killed in 2007. What would have happened had she survived and become the new leader of Pakistan? It could have been a great moment of turnaround for that country. Speaking of titles, the title of the book, Playing with Fire, what is it a reference to? The Playing with Fire refers to several things. But basically, it refers to military and political elites who have failed to take seriously or deal seriously with, the seething turmoil beneath. You have a civilian elite that's, very sort of self-involved and quite feudalistic in its mindset. You have this vast underclass that's, not enough schools, not enough opportunities, not enough access to justice, while the elite essentially, enjoys life. You don't have anywhere near enough redistribution of wealth, collection of revenue, trickle down. It's just not there. You have this very, very affluent elite that sort of thinks it's going to get by somehow with 180 million people struggling beneath. And then, even more importantly, you have a military establishment which is very large, very powerful, the most influential and important institution in the country for various reasons. Which, as we said earlier, has been thinking for a very long time that it was somehow going to be able to contain and control and manipulate all these Islamic extremist groups to their own ends, and didn't really acknowledge the possibility that that, as we say in one chapter, the monster could turn against its creators.
I want to ask you about the epilogue and about the gentleman who you profile and why you chose to end the book. And I'll find a picture. Maybe I can share that with our viewers.
It's the very last photo, yeah.
No help for the people listening to us on radio, though, as far as a picture goes.
We can describe him.
That's right. But here is the picture, and you can tell us who he is and why you chose to end the book.
This is Abdul Sattar Eidi. I call him the closest thing to a national hero in Pakistan. He's an elderly gentleman sitting there at his desk with a long gray beard, looking very humble and modest, sitting under a portrait of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And he is a man in his 80s. He has dedicated his life, really the last 40 years or more, to an organization that helps the poor, but does much more than that. It's essentially it's a free medical ambulance service that anywhere there's anybody anywhere in the country, whether it's a car accident or whatever, you'll see his ambulances going to carry people to the hospitals and to morgues. But it's much more than that. I mean, it's really a philosophy, and his whole philosophy. He's a revolutionary gentleman, and he believes and has always believed that you can't just help the poor, you have to empower the poor, which is a very threatening thing to say in a very hierarchical, patronage-based society. And so he and his wife, who've worked together for many years, they not only help but try to bring dignity to people who are outcast by the society, including, unwed mothers, disabled people, elderly people, all kinds of people who simply are not accepted by the society.
10 seconds remaining. Are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to the future of Pakistan?
Short-term pessimist and long-term optimist.
Good place to be. Pam Constable, thanks for joining us. Terrific book.
You're very welcome.
We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.